Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we give you a professional shortcut to mastery.
Today, we are undertaking a truly foundational and incredibly detailed investigation. We received a stack of source material scholarly texts that really dissect the classical legal framework of Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh.
And we're going right to the core.
Right to the core. Specifically, we're navigating the intricate rules governing tahara, that's ritual purification, and its ultimate purpose, salat, the obligatory prayer.
Yeah, and this isn't just a review of the basics, is it? This is a comprehensive journey into the core legal obligations, the fard.
And the astonishing depth of debate that surrounds them. Our mission is to distill these complex arguments into clear, sharp insights for you, the curious learner.
We're going to be exploring what defines, the smallest necessary action for purity, and we'll uncover why the legal definition of your face can actually change based on how thick your beard is.
And how legal estimation determines that a time limit for purification might be based on a mouse's decomposition. It gets that specific. What's fascinating here is the sheer professionalism of the early legal scholars. We are examining the khilaf, this organized scholarly range of interpretations.
The different opinions.
Exactly. And it ensures these foundational acts are precise, universally applicable, and designed to balance divine command with, well, human necessity. We'll cover the boundaries of wudu, the conditions for concessions like tayammum,
and how all this meticulous preparation enables the primary obligation of prayer.
That's the goal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just a quick note for those of you who find yourselves wanting to delve even further into the source texts, the specific academic arguments, all of that, we have compiled a complete reading list.
The full legal scholarship, if you will.
You can find the link for all those detailed sources in the description below.
So let's begin this deep dive by immediately immersing ourselves in the absolute essentials, the physical boundaries and required components of wudu, the minor ablution.
Okay, let's unpack this first major obligation. Washing the face. It's mandated by the Quran, and it sounds so straightforward.
It does.
But the sources make it clear that the legal definition of the face, al-wajh, is anything but simple. What are the established, precise physical boundaries that the jurists use?
The precision is absolutely paramount. The legal definition is rooted in the Arabic term wajh, which means that which confronts.
Okay.
So scholarly consensus establishes the vertical boundary as extending from the normal hairline, what they call the kisas ashar, all the way down to the bottom of the chin.
The asfal achdak.
Exactly. And horizontally, it stretches from earlobe to earlobe, the shamatai al-udnain. Before any facial hair grows, the command is simple. Wash that entire defined area of skin.
But the moment a beard starts to grow, this simple rule it explodes into a fascinating legal debate. Where does the water need to go once the hair gets thick?
This is where we see the classical schools establish these differing functional definitions. The overwhelming prevailing view, held by the majority of scholars, posits that if the facial hair is dense, the legal term is kathif, then the obligation to wash the skin beneath the hair is dropped. The washing obligation transfers to the surface of the hair itself.
So if your beard is thick enough to truly conceal the skin, the hair essentially becomes the legally recognizable face for the purpose of ablution.
That's the functional logic. Abu Hanifa's position, which is detailed in the sources, emphasizes that the required washing areas are those parts that have become apparent, or jahara.
So what you see is what you wash.
Pretty much. If a thick beard conceals the underlying skin, the bashara, then the surface of the hair is what is apparent, and therefore that's what fulfills the obligation of confronting the water.
But the sources immediately introduce a staunch legal opposition to this. I mean, not everyone agreed. What was Abu Abdullah al-Balkhi's counterargument?
Al-Balkhi famously maintained that washing the skin beneath dense hair remains strictly mandatory. His reasoning just completely avoids the functional argument of concealment.
So he's not concerned with what's visible?
Not at all. He argues that the area beneath the hair remains physically within the established boundary. Dakalan tat al-had, and hair growth doesn't have the legal power to nullify that original Quranic boundary. For him, the boundary is geographic and it's absolute.
That is a fundamental disagreement. It's about whether the legal boundary is fixed by geography or changed by function. It's a great illustration of how fiqh works.
And then the Shafi school complicated this even further by introducing a distinction based on texture. They differentiate between hair that is thick, kathif, where the obligation might be dropped, and hair that is thin or sparse kafif, where the underlying skin is still visible. If the skin is visible, it must be washed, regardless of the hair.
So it's a kind of middle ground.
It's a nuanced, conditional approach that tries to bridge the gap between those two more extreme positions.
Now, what about hair that physically extends beyond the defined boundaries of the face? The sources talk about the debate over dangling beard hair or al-mustarsal. Does hair hanging below the chin, for example, have to be included in the wash?
The prevailing Hanafi view is that this dangling hair falling outside that precise vertical limit of the waj does not require washing. It has left the legal boundary.
But the Shafi position, as the sources often cite, mandates washing it.
It does.
Why? I mean, if it's geographically outside the boundary, what's the legal argument for including it?
They argue that the dangling hair is a tabi, it's a follow-up, an attached dependency to the required part.
Ah, so because it's attached, it's part of the same thing.
Precisely. Since the root of the hair is within the required boundary, the extension of the hair shares the same ruling as its origin. This reflects a legal preference to treat the entirety of a growing element, even its excess, as unified with its source.
It's staggering that a single detail like beard length requires such a comprehensive legal analysis. Let's move to the second element of ablution, wiping the head, masharaz.
Right. So the command to wipe the head is in the Quran, but there is an immediate and powerful legal consensus and ijma that this command does not require wiping the entire head.
That's interesting. So everyone agrees you don't have to wipe the whole thing.
Everyone. If the purpose was total coverage, the grammatical structure in Arabic would likely have been different. So the legal debate then pivots to defining the minimum required amount.
How do scholars determine that minimum required measure? Is there a precise measurement, like an inch or something?
It relies heavily on urf, or customary understanding. The wiping has to cover an amount that is commonly recognized as having fulfilled the act of wiping.
So it's about what people would generally agree looks like you've wiped your head.
Exactly. The sources specifically criticize the position that merely wiping 1 or 3 hairs is sufficient because that just doesn't meet the customary definition of mash. Therefore, the estimated measure of the forelock, the nasaya, is used as the practical, accepted minimum required amount.
So it's about functional recognition in the community rather than an arbitrary number.
Yes. And we also note Malik's position, which, while not the majority view, is important. He held that wiping the entire head minus a small part is permissible.
Which, again, reinforces that total coverage isn't the point.
It is not mandatory, correct. The goal is a recognizable, substantial act of wiping.
This leads perfectly to the rule on head coverings. If the goal is reaching the outer layer of the hair, what happens with items like turbans, hats, or women's veils?
The general and pretty strict rule is that wiping directly over thick coverings is invalid. The covering acts as a barrier, preventing water from reaching the hair's surface.
And there's precedent for this.
A strong one. The source material emphasizes this by citing the reported action of Aisha, who would reach underneath her veil to wipe her head, establishing the priority of direct access to the hair's surface.
Is that barrier always prohibitive, though? Or is the emphasis on the result?
It's primarily on the result, the maqsood. An exception is made for a woman's veil if the material is thin enough to allow water penetration, yanfid oma.
So if water can get through, it counts.
If the water can demonstrably reach the hair roots through the veil, the objective is achieved and the wiping is considered valid.
That distinction, based on permeability, is incredibly precise. What if the water reaches the head by a totally passive means, like an unexpected downpour? You're just walking outside and it starts raining.
The legal scholars determine that if rain, or matar, strikes the head and reaches that minimum required amount of the hair surface, it suffices, even without the active intervention of the person wiping.
Really?
Yes. This reinforces the principle that the physical act of wiping, the file, is secondary to the legal objective, the delivery of water to the required area. If the water gets there, the obligation is met.
Having addressed the mandatory pillars, the fard, we can now explore the highly recommended but generally non-obligatory acts, the sunan.
And this is where we see major jurisprudential divergence on what constitutes a core condition versus, let's say, an enhancement.
Right, and the first two major contentions are sequence, tartib washing limbs in order,
Yeah.
and continuity, nuwalat washing without interruption. For the Hanafi school, these are generally just sunnah.
Correct. The general scholarly view confirms sequential washing is a recommendation, a sunnah, derived from the Prophet's practice. But this is a massive legal switch point.
Why is that?
Because the Shafi school considers tartib to be a necessary condition, a shait. This means violating the sequence renders the ablution invalid in one school, but just suboptimal in the other.
And what about continuity?
Similarly, mu'alat, the continuity of washing, is not a condition for most, but Imam Malik insists it is absolutely essential for validity.
Why are these differences so entrenched? Is it just based on different interpretations of the same verses?
Yes. For Tartib, the Quran lists the limbs in order, but the Hanafi scholars often argue that the ordering is illustrative, not strictly mandatory.
So it's more of a suggestion.
They'd say the key command is wash, and the use of the conjunction and in Arabic doesn't always necessitate sequence. Shafi, on the other hand, sees that ordering as a direct reflection of God's desired sequence, which makes it conditional.
The most counterintuitive difference for me relates to niyyah, or intention. Why do some schools, like the Hanafi school, argue that intention is not a necessary condition for wudu? I mean, that seems fundamental to all religious actions.
It does, but it hinges on the legal definition of wudu itself. The general Hanafi view holds that wudu functions primarily as a cleansing, the removal of a ritual impediment.
A physical state change.
Exactly. If they considered intention a condition, it would imply that the physical cleansing performed by a non-Muslim, a kafir, would be ritually invalid, even if perfectly executed. Since wudu, in their view, primarily removes an impediment that enables prayer, they argue that the physical act of purification is sufficient even without the conscious intent of worship.
So they view wudu as a preparation or a conditional physical state, whereas the Shafi view treats wudu as an act of worship and ibadah in itself.
Which must, by definition, include intention. Precisely. If wudu is ibadah, intention is essential. If it is purely preparatory tahara, the physical cleansing suffices. This difference illuminates the entire philosophical divide between the schools on the legal nature of purification.
Let's discuss the siwak, the toothstick. The sources categorize this as a sunnah muakkada. It's strongly recommended, based on the continuous counsel from the angel Jibril.
The emphasis on the siwak is incredibly high. The Hanafi rules are absolute and consistent, highlighting its importance. It's permitted, whether it's wet or dry, for a person who's fasting or not fasting.
And crucially, before or after noon, the zawal.
Yes, but the sources did note a minor point of contention here regarding fasting individuals.
What was that?
The Shafi school holds that using the siwak after noon is disliked makruh for a fasting person. They reason that the resulting change in breath odor is sometimes seen as a sign of worship, an olfactory change that should be preserved. The Hanafi position overrides this, adhering strictly to the unrestricted nature of the prophetic guidance, which placed emphasis on cleanliness at all times, independent of the fasting state.
Before we move on, let's just touch on the prohibition of excessive water use, the israf. It seems almost paradoxical given how central water is to this whole process.
The prohibition is explicit, and it's deeply moral. The source material recounts the severe warning given to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. When he was using water extravagantly, he was told to stop the waste.
And he questioned it.
He did. He asked if israf applied even to wudu, an act of worship where water is required. And the Prophet reportedly responded, yes, even if you are on the bank of a flowing river, a nora jari.
Wow. That immediately transforms the concept of waste from a physical problem, like running out of water, into a moral and spiritual one.
Indeed. It defines frugality not as a consequence of scarcity, but as a virtue required even in abundance. The act of washing must be efficient and mindful, regardless of the water source.
We shift now to the powerful concept of concessions, or ruksa.
These are legal easements granted by divine law out of compassion to remove undue hardship, dafsul mashaka. And the most prominent example is mash alal kafain, wiping over the footwear.
This is where we see the law really adapting to the practical realities of life, especially travel and cold climates. The central concept here is the duration rule, the takwit.
The timing is based on famous, widely transmitted hadith reports and represents the consensus view, amatuhum. For a resident, a muqim, the concession lasts for 1 day and 1 night.
And for a traveler?
For a traveler, a musafir, it's extended to 3 days and 3 nights. The extension is a direct correlation to the increased degree of hardship faced by the traveler.
But Imam Malik offered a significant dissent, didn't he? He argued that the wiping isn't timed at all. Why would he reject such a well-established time limit?
Malik's argument was often based on avoiding legislative limitation unless explicitly demanded. He saw the ruling as a general concession for comfort that should last as long as the state of purity was maintained, regardless of external time limits.
But that could be indefinite.
And that was the counter-argument. The majority argued that accepting his position would lead to potentially indefinite use, undermining the primary obligation of washing the feet. The sources note that even early dissenters like Ibn Abbas eventually conformed to the established time limits because of the strength of the prophetic tradition.
Let's nail down the most technical element. The start time debate. Itibar al-Mudda. When exactly does that clock start? Is it the moment the socks are put on, the first wipe, or the first event of impurity?
The majority view, al-Amma, is meticulously argued. The duration starts from the moment of the first hadath, the minor event that breaks purity, that occurs after the footwear was donned.
Why isn't the clock started at the time of wearing the socks? That just seems simpler.
The rationale lies in the function of the footwear. The socks, or kufen, act as a legal barrier, a mani, that substitutes for washing the feet.
Right.
This concession only becomes legally and functionally relevant after an act of impurity occurs. Before the hadath, there's no purification requirement to substitute. The time limit is applied to the concession, and the concession is only activated by the need for wudu.
That logic makes the concession a tool activated by necessity, rather than a perpetual state granted just by wearing the socks.
Precisely. It ties the legal mechanism directly to the functional need for purification.
This structure leads us to some complex status transitions. What happens if a resident who starts wiping then begins to travel before their one-day period is complete?
Their status immediately converts, and they benefit from the extended 3-day period for the traveler. This is the unanimous view, even if the conversion happens after they've already performed a wipe. The new status overrides the old limit, and the clock keeps running based on the original hadath.
Conversely, what if a traveler settles down and becomes a resident a muqim mid-period? Say they're 25 hours into their 3-day concession and then arrive home.
If they settle after completing more than the resident's allowed period, so past 24 hours, they must immediately remove their footwear and wash their feet.
Wait, that seems harsh. They've been pure for 25 hours, but because they traveled for 25 hours and then stopped, they lose their purity the moment they cross the city limits. Doesn't that undermine the principle of ease?
It sounds harsh, but the legal reasoning is ironclad. The concession is tied to the condition of hardship, which is travel.
Yeah.
Once the condition of travel hardship is removed, the law reverts to the stricter rule for the resident. Since the resident's maximum time limit has been exceeded, the purity can no longer be maintained under the new status.
So the feet must be washed to reestablish purity.
Correct. That makes the status the absolute governor of the concession, regardless of the time accrued.
What if they had settled down before the 24-hour mark?
Then they would simply complete the remainder of the resident's 24-hour limit.
And finally, what negates the wiping itself? The nawaqid al-mash.
Aside from the obvious, the expiration of the time limit, the wiping is immediately invalidated by the occurrence of major impurity. Hadath Ghaliz or janaba.
Like sexual defilement.
Exactly. The concession is explicitly only granted for minor events like urine, feces, wind, or sleep.
Why is there no rukhsah for major events?
It comes back to the frequency and the hardship. Minor events are repetitive and common, making repeated removal of footwear a significant haraj. Major events are less frequent.
So the hardship of taking them off is less pressing.
Precisely. Since the need for a full cleansing, or ghusl, is less frequent, the underlying obligation to fully wash the feet remains.
If water is completely unavailable or unusable, the law offers the ultimate concession: tayammum, or dry ablution.
This is purification for extraordinary circumstances.
And what's the precise legal definition?
Linguistically, tayammum is simply intention or purpose, quast. Legally, however, it's defined as the ritual use of clean earth sa'id tayyib, applied to the face and the hands with the specific intention of achieving ritual purity subject to rigorous conditions.
Let's address the physical requirements, the pillars, the arkan, immediately, because the sources show major disagreement on the number of strikes required and the extent of the arm wiping.
The general Hanafi view, often considered the most expansive in terms of required coverage, demands 2 strikes. 1 strike for the face and a 2nd strike for the hands extending all the way up to the elbows, the marfakin.
And the counter-arguments.
Well, Malik and one of the Shafi opinions also require 2 strikes, but they limit the wiping of the hands only up to the wrists, the riscain. That substantially reduces the required surface area.
But there's an even more extreme view cited.
There is. It comes from Zuri, who argued for wiping the hands all the way up to the armpits, the abat.
Wiping the armpits. That's so far beyond the conventional understanding of hand. What possible legal argument supports that view?
His reasoning is purely linguistic and textual. Zuri argued that the term hand, yad, mentioned in the tayammum verse, linguistically covers the entire upper limb up to the armpit, unless it's explicitly limited.
Okay.
He noted that in the wudu verse, the term yad is restricted by the phrase up to the elbows. Since the tayammum verse lacks that specific elbow limitation, he argued the expansive linguistic definition must apply.
That is absolutely riveting. A single word's definition creating a legal range that spans from the wrist all the way to the armpit.
It underscores the professional rigor involved in textual interpretation. Moving on to the material itself. The requirement for clean earth, al-Said. Scholars debate whether actual dust adhesion is mandatory.
So, does the hand actually need to come away looking dusty?
Abu Hanifa's view is the most permissive. He held that the condition is merely touching the surface of the earth, mashwaz ard, and passing the hands over the limbs. The physical adhesion of dust is not a prerequisite for validity.
And the other side.
Conversely, Muhammad held that some portion, juuzes of the earth, must adhere to the hand, yaltazik. His position insists that the physical transfer of the purifying medium must be evident, making the act purposeful, not just an action performed over the surface.
If we follow the Hanafi view that dust adhesion isn't necessary, what earth-based materials are permitted?
A vast range of non-combustible earth-based materials are allowed. The source material lists many: smooth stone, walls that have been painted or mudded, gypsum, arsenic sulfide, and mineral salt. The key exclusion is salt derived from water, confirming the medium must be of pure earth origin.
The procedure provided in the sources is also incredibly cautious.
Yes, the prescribed method is aimed at itiyat, extreme precaution. For the second strike, wiping the arms, it advises using a different part of the palm than what was used for the face.
Why is that?
To ensure you aren't using spent or mustamal dust that has already performed purification on the face. It also advises shaking the hands once or twice, a nafta, to remove excess dust. The goal is contact with the earth medium, not accumulating dirt.
Let's discuss the conditions for validity, the absence of water. This is defined as either literal absence, so distance, or functional absence.
Literal absence means water is physically distant. The legal estimations for distance vary widely, from 1 mile to simply being unable to hear the call to prayer from the water source.
What does functional absence, or ajiz, entail?
Functional absence means water is available, but using it carries a risk of harm. This includes fear of exacerbating an illness, marad, or worsening a wound.
And there's a famous story about this.
A chilling one. The story of the man with a head wound who was commanded to take a full bath, died as a result, and earned the prophet's rebuke. They killed him. May God kill them. Why did they not ask?
That's a powerful moral lesson embedded in the legal system, showing that the preservation of life and health overrides a ritual obligation when consultation is neglected.
It sets the functional rule that necessity allows the concession. Other scenarios include the risk of thirst, the presence of threats like enemies or predators, or simply lacking the tools to draw the water. If safety or survival is compromised, tayammum is permitted.
And we noted that tayammum is allowed for prayers that can't be easily made up later, even if water might be available soon.
Yes. For prayers like the janazah funeral prayer or Eid prayers where replacement is functionally impossible, tayammum is permitted. The immediacy of the opportunity justifies using the concession.
We now move to the specific tripwires that negate wudu, the nawaqid.
This covers not just the obvious events, but external bleeding, laughter, and touching.
The basic principle is that any impurity exiting the two main paths, the sabalain, invalidates wudu. But what about impurity exiting elsewhere, like from a wound? This is a core point of khilaf.
It is, and the debate centers on the principle of transfer integral. If blood, pus, or serous fluid flows away from the immediate area of the wound to a clean area, the Hanafi view holds that wudu is invalidated.
So it's about the impurity moving.
The logic is that the impurity has physically transitioned from the internal space, the batin, to the visible external space, the dahir, necessitating a renewal of purity.
So the visibility and movement of the fluid is the legal trigger for the Hanafi school.
Precisely. The Shafi school fundamentally disagrees. They insist that invalidation only occurs if the substance exits the sabalain. They view external bleeding as an event of physical contamination, not a ritual hadath.
What about internal movements that result in fluid exiting the mouth, namely vomiting or K?
Vomiting invalidates wudu if the quantity is deemed significant. The complexity arises when small amounts of vomit occur multiple times.
So you have to add them up.
Right. But how? The scholars needed a legal rule for aggregation. Abu Yusuf argued that small vomits aggregate only if they occur within the same sitting, the same majlis. Muhammad argued they aggregate only if they share the same cause, like continuous nausea. This legal engineering is aimed at finding a consistent definition of significant quantity to avoid endless doubt.
Let's integrate a critical clarification here that helps in understanding impurity. The distinction between the three types of fluid that can exit the male body, mani, mazi, and wadi.
Yeah.
Why is this distinction so essential?
It's vital because it determines the level of purification required. If it only requires wudu, it's a minor hadath. If it requires ghusl, it's a major hadath.
So what are they?
Mani, or semen, is the thick fluid that's sometimes described as having the odor of palm pollen. Its exit always requires ghusl, the major ablution.
Okay.
Mazi is pre-seminal fluid. It's thin, whitish, and typically exits during arousal. A famous hadith explicitly establishes that mazi only requires wudu, the minor ablution.
And the last one.
Finally, wadi is a thin fluid excreted after urination. It's essentially residual urine, and so it only requires wudu. Without this distinction, you might incorrectly perform ghusl for mazi, or conversely, fail to perform ghusl for mani.
That structural clarity is key. Let's address the psychological trap of doubt, or waswasa. If a person constantly feels minor wetness but can't confirm it's one of those three fluids, what's the legal recourse?
The law has to provide an antidote to obsessive doubt. If an individual is prone to waswasa and can't definitively confirm the substance, they're instructed to ignore it and proceed with prayer.
Why?
Because the core legal maxim is applied. Certainty of purity is not removed by doubt. You must have certainty of impurity to negate an established state of purity.
We move now to sleep. Sleep is an indirect invalidator. Why is sleep considered a sabab, a cause of impurity?
Sleep causes two critical things. The loosening of the seal, the wika al-list, which is the relaxation of sphincter control, and the general relaxation of the joints, istirka al-mafasil. These conditions increase the likelihood of impurity escaping unconsciously.
But not all sleep is invalidating. What position preserves wudu?
Sleep only invalidates wudu in positions where the joints are significantly relaxed, like reclining. Sleep while sitting upright, qaidan mustaqiran, is generally permissible, provided the posterior remains firmly fixed to the ground.
And if you fall over?
If you fall asleep and then fall over, losing that fixed position before you wake up, the wudu is negated, as you've entered the state of reclining.
The sources introduce a highly debated invalidator within prayer: laughter. Specifically, loud laughter. Quakaha.
This is a famous point unique to the Hanafi school, based on the principle of istisan, or juridical preference. Loud laughter, kaka, invalidates both the prayer and the wudu. Both. This is rooted in the anecdote of the Bedouin who fell into a well during prayer, leading the Prophet to command those who laughed loudly to repeat both acts.
Why elevate a loss of control like laughter to the status of a ritual impurity like urination?
The istisan argument is that such a profound loss of spiritual control and reverence within the act of submission is deemed equivalent in gravity to a major physical impurity. It completely severs the connection.
But not just smiling.
No, a mere smile, a tabassum, is unanimously agreed to preserve wudu. Other schools, like Shafi's, reject this whole idea, arguing laughter only breaks the prayer as it's not a real hadath.
Let's discuss the controversy over touching or kissing women, lamastuma nisa. This is one of the most visible legal disputes.
The entire dispute hinges on the interpretation of the Quranic term lamasa. The majority view, primarily the Hanafi school, holds that physical contact does not invalidate wudu. They prioritize the report of the Prophet kissing his wives and then proceeding to prayer without renewing ablution.
And their interpretation of the verse.
They interpret lamasa metaphorically as referring to sexual intercourse, jimar. Furthermore, they use a practical argument. Touching is a frequent occurrence in daily life, and ruling it an invalidator would lead to undue hardship, violating the spirit of ease in the law.
What about the other views?
The dissenting views are highly specific. Malik argues it invalidates wudu only if the touching is done with lust or desire, shahwa. Here, the physical act is neutral, but the emotional response renders it impure.
And the most stringent view?
That's the Shafi view, which often holds that lamasa is literal touching, and therefore any physical contact, regardless of intent or lust, invalidates wudu.
So it's about prioritizing a literal reading of the text versus the prophetic practice.
That's the core of the debate.
Finally, touching one's own genitals, does that break wudu?
The general Hanafi view is that it does not. They cite statements from companions, some of whom said it was no different than touching any other part of the body. They challenged the famous hadith that implies invalidation on procedural grounds.
What grounds?
They argue that this ruling concerns a matter of public trial, a frequent common act, and therefore should have been supported by a greater consensus rather than resting on a single report, a khabar wahid.
We now address ghusl, the major purification required for janaba.
This is far more comprehensive, requiring water to reach every part of the body.
What are the two absolute primary triggers for ghusl?
Ghusl is required following ejaculation, mani, or following sexual intercourse, alaj, or penetration, even if there is no ejaculation.
That latter point is critical.
And based on consensus, penetration alone establishes the ritual condition of janaba.
There's a key legal difference regarding the condition of ejaculation itself, specifically concerning the state of lust.
Yes. This is a subtle yet important technical disagreement. Abu Hanifa and Muhammad hold that ghusl is required if the semen separated from the body with lust, with shahwa, even if it exits the body later without lust.
So the point of separation from the source is the legal trigger, not the point of exit.
Precisely. This applies to complex scenarios. For instance, if a man performs ghusl after intercourse but before urinating, and remnants of semen exit afterwards, a new ghusl is required. Abu Yusuf, conversely, generally requires that the separation and the exit must be accompanied by lust for a new ghusl to be mandatory.
Now that we've clarified the distinction between mani, mazi, and wadi, with mani requiring ghus, let's look at female purification. What about haid, menstruation, and nifas, post-childbirth bleeding? What activities are forbidden?
During menstruation, haid, prayer, fasting, and reciting the Quran are strictly prohibited. The reasoning is clear. The reported prophetic tradition states that nothing restrained the prophet from reciting the Quran except janaba, and by extension, haid is treated with the same severity.
How do women legally determine the end of the menstrual period, which dictates when ghusl is required?
The indicator is not just the cessation of the dark color. The legal indicator is the appearance of the pure white discharge known as al-kasa al-bayha.
Pure white, like gypsum.
Exactly. The scholarly consensus is based on the practice of Aisha, who instructed women not to consider themselves pure until they saw this specific white marker. The color and nature of the discharge is the legal sign of cessation.
Regarding nifas, post-childbirth bleeding, the duration is disputed.
The majority Hanafi scholars set the maximum duration at 40 days, based on the most widely confirmed prophetic traditions. Malik and Shafi set the maximum at 60 days, but the source material rejects this 60-day maximum as being based on weaker evidence.
Finally, let's revisit the concession regarding braided hair, the fira, during ghusl. Why is the hardship of undoing the braids deemed sufficient to warrant a legal concession?
If a woman has tightly braided hair, undoing it for every major ablution would represent a continuous and severe hardship, a haraj.
So the concession is granted.
It is. She does not need to undo the braids for ghusl from janaba, provided she pours water over her head in a way that ensures it demonstrably reaches the roots of the hair, the usul sharik. The Prophet reportedly granted this exact ruling, confirming that reaching the roots suffices.
We have meticulously mapped out the rules of purification, the tahara. Now, we have to connect this entire framework back to its ultimate goal, the establishment of the 5 daily prayers, salat.
And the obligation, the fartiyah, is proven comprehensively, starting with the Quran, al-Kitab.
How so?
The obligation is established through continuous, explicit divine command in numerous verses, consistently commanding the faithful to establish prayer, aqama salat. This command is foundational and non-negotiable.
As it's tied to time.
Yes. The Quran explicitly defines prayer as a timed obligation on believers, a kitaban makweta. This legal status demands not only that the act be performed, but that it be performed within its specific defined time window.
Which is why we need the rigorous purity rules we just discussed.
It all connects?
How does the Quran establish the precise times for all 5 obligatory prayers?
The verses describe the phases of the sun and night. The command to pray at the 2 sides of the day, Tarafai Anhar, covers the morning prayer, Fajr, and the afternoon prayers, Zuhr and Asr.
And at night?
The command regarding portions of the night, Zulafan min al-Layl, covers the sunset prayer, Maghrib, and the night prayer, Isha. Thus, the Quran provides the temporal framework for all 5 obligations.
And the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah, confirms and specifies the details.
Absolutely. The Prophet's reported sayings and farewell sermons provide the explicit practical confirmation, he stated. Worship your Lord and pray your 5 prayers. This dual establishment makes the obligation ironclad.
Beyond Scripture, the sources argue that the obligation is also established through pure reason, al-maqal. What is the logical, rational basis for such a heavy daily obligation?
The first logical foundation is the mandated expression of gratitude, shukr an-niyam. Prayer is seen as the required response to the infinite blessings of creation, the blessing of having been created in the most excellent form, and the health of one's limbs. Logic dictates that such unearned benevolence requires an active display of thanks.
And prayer is the designated format for that.
It is. Secondly, prayer is the primary method for the servant to display humility and utter submission, ubudiyya. Think about the structure. It involves standing in reverence, bowing the torso in submission, and then the profound act of prostration, placing the most noble part of the body, the face, on the ground. The sequence is designed to shatter arrogance.
The physical motions themselves are intentional expressions of this submission.
Yes. The meticulousness of the preparation, the tahara, is a prerequisite for this display of humility. The rigor of wudu directly mirrors the severity of the obligation itself.
Finally, the sources cite the functional, preventative purpose. How does a spiritual act performed only a few minutes at a time throughout the day protect the believer from sin?
The Quran explicitly states this mechanism. Indeed, prayer prohibits immorality and wrongdoing. The logic here is psychological and spiritual. Performing the prayer 5 times daily constantly reinstills taqwa, a profound sense of reverence and awe of God.
A constant check.
A constant check. It acts as a constant resetting of the moral compass, designed to protect the believer from backsliding into negative behavior.
We've covered the core rules of purity and their purpose. Let's delve into some of the most specialized and technical legal disputes, starting with water purity, specifically residual water, sur.
Shur is the water remaining after a human or animal drinks from it. The general rule is purity, tahur. The water remaining after a human drinks is pure, even if the person is menstruating.
What's the one exception?
The exception is if the human had just consumed alcohol, khamr, which would have left their mouth ritually impure, contaminating the residual water.
What happens when a serious contaminant falls into a large, non-flowing body of water, like a well?
The necessity of draining the well, nij, is confirmed by historical legal precedent regardless of the quantity of water. The sources cite the famous incident of the black man, the Zinji, falling into the Zamzam well in Mecca.
And what was the ruling?
The consensus of the companions was to draw out all the water, establishing that even massive pooled water sources can be entirely rendered impure by serious contamination.
This brings us to a classic legal problem requiring juridical estimation, the case of the mouse in the well, where the timing of the contamination is unknown.
This requires applying the principle of isisan, juridical preference, and legal estimation. If a mouse, a fara, is found in a well, and the time of the fall is unknown, the condition of the mouse is the legal determinant.
Okay, so what if it's decomposed?
The strict view holds that if the mouse is bloated or decomposed, that implies a long presence. Therefore, all prayers made using that water for the previous 3 days and nights must be repeated. The legal assumption is that the contamination has been present for that duration.
That 3-day period is a purely legal construction based on forensic evidence, which is fascinating. What if the mouse is not decomposed?
If the mouse is not bloated or decomposed, a milder yet still cautionary view limits the required repetition to 1 day and 1 night. This is based on a cautionary estimation of the shortest plausible duration for the contamination to occur and be noticed.
Let's discuss the status of the excused al-alotar. These are people suffering from continuous, unavoidable minor events, like continuous irregular bleeding or a constantly flowing wound.
For these individuals, the continuous flow of impurity can't be stopped, yet they must pray. So concession is granted that binds their purity to the time of the obligatory prayer, the waqt al-salat.
So their wudu is temporary.
Exactly. They perform wudu for the prayer, and their state of purity remains functionally valid only until that specific prayer time expires. Once the time for Zuhr prayer ends and the time for Asr prayer begins, their minor purity is automatically negated.
So they have to renew wudu for every single prayer time.
They do. This ensures they can perform the necessary obligation without undue hardship, but it prevents them from using one ablution for multiple prayers across different time boundaries.
Finally, let's revisit the contentious historical dispute over using nabid, or date water, for wudu in the complete absence of water.
Nabid at tamr is water in which dates have been soaked, extracting the sweetness. This is a highly disputed position held primarily by Abu Hanifa. He allowed its use for wudu only when water was literally absent, citing a hadith about the night of the jinn.
What were the strict conditions for its permitted use?
It had to be thin and either sweet or slightly sour. If the water was thick or if it had undergone fermentation, boiling, or foamed, it became forbidden. The crucial condition was that it must not be an intoxicant, a maskir.
But the opponents of this ruling were vocal, weren't they? They questioned the source.
Their objection was twofold. First, they argued that the hadith was a singular report, a khabar wahid, and shouldn't override the clear Quranic command to use water or earth.
And the second objection.
They attacked the narrator's reliability. However, the Hanafi position defended the report's authenticity, arguing that an established, specific prophetic practice, even if reported singularly, should be prioritized over a general Quranic statement, especially under the condition of literal water absence.
We have spent this time navigating the highly structured world of Tahara, realizing that the rules are not static, but a meticulously debated system designed to balance the demanding divine command, the Azma.
With the necessary concessions for human life, the ruksa and daf al-haraj. Every legal distinction, from the definition of the hand in dry ablution to the timing of impurity detection, serves to guarantee that the path to purity is comprehensible, comprehensive, and ultimately maintainable.
The sheer breadth of opinion we've explored, from how much of the face to wash under a beard, to the exact moment a traveler's concession ends, it reveals the thoroughness with which these foundational concepts of fiqh were professionalized.
It's a system that ensures that the obligatory acts, the fard, could be maintained under almost any condition, linking the minutiae of washing back to the grand expression of submission, the 5 daily prayers.
This deep dive really highlights the principle that knowledge is power, especially when you're facing religious or technical obligations.
It is. By understanding the varying scholarly perspectives, the underlying rationale for the legal differences, and the context of the concessions, you gain a richer, more comprehensive grasp of these core concepts. This prevents you from rigid adherence when ease is warranted and ensures strict adherence to the true obligations when necessary.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into purification and obligation. If you are ready to explore the full source material for yourself, the original texts and academic arguments that fueled this discussion, you can find the link and additional context in the description. Join us next time for another deep dive.